The ultimatum fell like a spark on dry earth. Within seconds, one president's defiance collided with another's silence, turning a diplomatic script into a continental test of will. Ibrahim Traoré spoke not only to Uganda, but to every ruler who fears what freedom might ignite. So what happens when one refusal triggers 1,000 echoes? Across Africa, the first domino had already begun to tilt. He had not spoken to impress but to expose. The demand to free Bobi Wine was only the surface. Underneath it lay a deeper reckoning about what African sovereignty now means. Ibrahim Traoré framed it as a choice, either loyalty to the old order or courage to build a new one. For every African leader listening, that choice cut close. Silence meant consent, and consent meant surrender. The Sahel had already learned what submission costs. The rest of the continent was about to find out. Between the applause of the streets and the unease of the palaces, a line was being drawn in real time. Would the world hear a threat or a promise that Africa's youth would no longer bow? That answer would decide not only Uganda's tomorrow, but the direction of a generation. Before his ultimatum echoed across the continent, few outside the Sahel understood how Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of defiance. In less than 2 years, the young captain from Burkina Faso had turned isolation into influence. After expelling foreign troops and rejecting external tutelage, he built what analysts call the Sahel Alliance, a fragile, improvised network linking Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger under one banner of African sovereignty. To many, it looked like risk. To him, it was recovery. That background explained why his voice carried unusual weight when he addressed Uganda. He was not a distant observer, but a man who had tested his words in fire. When he told President Museveni to release Bobi Wine, he was also warning every entrenched ruler that the age of impunity was closing. The comparison was striking. A nation once colonized now demanding moral accountability from a regime older than its independence. A small reveal came in the data that followed. Since 2022, Burkina Faso's trade with Sahel neighbors has increased by nearly 30%, while its military coordination with Mali and Niger expanded fivefold, a demonstration that independence can scale, not shrink. These figures, modest but measurable, turned rhetoric into proof. They showed that what began as a survival move in Ouagadougou had evolved into a continental signal. Yet behind the applause, the question deepened. If sovereignty is reclaimed by confrontation, can it also be sustained by cooperation? Traoré's speech forced that paradox into daylight. It was less a threat to Uganda than a mirror held up to the entire post-colonial order. To understand why the words of Ibrahim Traoré resonated beyond borders, one must look at how he positioned himself, not as a savior, but as a reflection of a generation denied its own agency. In every interview, he spoke less of power than of fatigue. The exhaustion of waiting for fairness to arrive from elsewhere. That tone stripped of ornament became his strength. When he said, "We would rather be poor and free than comfortable and colonized," it was not ideology, it was confession. In Burkina Faso's streets, his message turned into motion. University students quoted his lines on handmade banners. Soldiers repeated them in quiet barracks conversations. Even outside the Sahel, his image began to circulate. A young leader in fatigues, face calm but eyes unflinching. To many Africans under aging regimes, he embodied a possibility long considered extinct, that conviction could still move history. The first impact was not diplomatic, it was psychological. Within days, youth organizations in Ghana, Senegal and Kenya released open letters urging their governments to listen before pretending not to hear. For once, a political demand felt personal. Ibrahim Traoré had translated rebellion into responsibility. And yet the test ahead was clear. Inspiration without structure burns out fast. Would this spark sustain itself or fade under pressure? The answer, like his own rise, would depend not on charisma, but on whether conviction could organize. So what happens when belief becomes blueprint? It began with a sentence that broke protocol. "Release Bobi Wine," Ibrahim Traoré said, "or face the consequences." The air in diplomatic circles stiffened. No African president had spoken so directly to another in decades. Within hours, international newsrooms ran fragments of his speech as if decoding a declaration of intent. Across Kampala, soldiers tightened the perimeter around Bobi Wine's home. In Ouagadougou, the statement replayed on public screens. applause drowning the anchor's cautious tone. The trigger was small, but its aftershocks were continental. Uganda's government dismissed Traoré's demand as external interference. Yet silence from neighboring leaders proved louder than any rebuttal. Mali and Niger publicly supported Burkina Faso's stance. ECOWAS hesitated. The African Union, caught between decorum and discomfort, issued a carefully worded appeal for dialogue. Each reaction formed part of the same domino chain. The more others refused to choose sides, the clearer the divide became. At home, the momentum intensified. In the capital, spontaneous rallies erupted, not to condemn Uganda, but to celebrate courage. Posters of Ibrahim Traoré appeared beside those of Thomas Sankara, merging past idealism with present defiance. For citizens accustomed to being lectured by their leaders, it was disorienting to see a head of state speaking like them. One local newspaper captured it in a headline: "A president sounds like the people." The climax came when Uganda temporarily recalled its ambassador from Burkina Faso, calling the remarks an unprecedented breach of African unity. The irony was sharp. Unity had become synonymous with silence. In response, Traoré announced the withdrawal of his own envoy from Kampala and the downgrading of diplomatic ties. It was a calculated escalation, and every move was public. By then, foreign analysts were already predicting economic fallout, but the symbolic cost was greater. A generational story was being rewritten. For decades, African youth had spoken truth to power. Now power was speaking back in their name. When the dust settled, nothing looked quite the same. The Sahel, once portrayed as a periphery of crisis, had become the stage where legitimacy was redefined. And in the echoes of that moment, one question lingered like a drumbeat. Had Ibrahim Traoré just challenged a man, or the very idea of how authority survives in Africa? Numbers often tell the quieter story, the one beneath the slogans. Since Ibrahim Traoré's declaration, the signals have been measurable even when the intentions remain political. Within 3 weeks of the ultimatum, regional trade data between Burkina Faso and Uganda showed a 17% contraction, small in scale but symbolically immense. Logistics reports tracked a 40% decline in cross-border cargo routed through intermediary Sahel states, a pattern suggesting that commercial hesitation can travel faster than diplomacy. The delta, modest yet consistent, validated what the speech implied. Economic trust follows political respect. Analysts then mapped a second layer of consequence. In early 2025, surveys by the Pan-African Policy Observatory indicated that 61% of respondents under 35 in West and Central Africa viewed Traoré's intervention as necessary, even when they disagreed with his tone. Among older elites, approval fell to 28%, revealing a generational divide sharper than national boundaries. What looked like defiance in Kampala registered as credibility in Ouagadougou. Comparative indicators confirmed the shift. Since 2022, Burkina Faso's defense cooperation with Mali and Niger has expanded from 3 joint operations to 15, while joint procurement savings reached an estimated $8 million USD, a small figure globally, but proof that independence can fund itself when solidarity replaces subservience. Economists call this a sovereignty multiplier. Each act of self-assertion compounds into leverage that no foreign base can guarantee. At the same time, diplomatic isolation, the very consequence Traoré promised, remained more reputational than material. Uganda's external investment inflows dipped by 4% quarter to quarter, a statistically thin drop, yet its social media sentiment score collapsed by half within a month. Perception had become the new currency, and Africa's digital audience was trading fast. These figures form a baseline to delta sequence that mirrors the new political rhythm. A cause announced in words, its echo traced in data. For all its controversy, the speech produced measurable outcomes without a single sanction signed. It proved that the architecture of influence no longer belongs solely to those with armies or aid budgets. It now belongs to whoever controls the story. In that recalibrated ledger, Ibrahim Traoré was not only a speaker, he was a variable that altered equations. And if such changes can occur from one microphone in Ouagadougou, what might happen when more voices refuse to obey the old arithmetic? The critics answered quickly. Some argued that Ibrahim Traoré had crossed a diplomatic line, turning solidarity into interference. They warned that public confrontation could isolate Burkina Faso further, jeopardizing fragile partnerships still needed for security and trade. In their logic, caution equaled survival. A young leader, they said, should learn the patience of institutions rather than the theater of defiance, yet his defenders countered with another ledger. They pointed out that silence too has a cost, the slow normalization of repression disguised as stability. If sovereignty means anything, they insisted, it must include the courage to call out betrayal among peers. Traoré's ultimatum, in that reading, was not arrogance but audit, a moral accounting long overdue. Between these poles lies the real dilemma of modern African leadership. Is unity measured by quiet consensus, or by the integrity to confront those who betray shared ideals? The precedent matters. When sanctions come from outside the continent, they breed resentment. When they rise from within, they create ownership. Data lends perspective. In a Continental Governance Index released that year, nations ranked highest in transparency also reported greater youth political engagement, a correlation of 0.67. The numbers do not settle the debate, but they show that accountability and participation often travel together. For Ibrahim Traoré, that correlation was the proof he needed. His challenge to Museveni was less personal than systemic, a statement that legitimacy, once internalized, can no longer be outsourced. Both sides of the argument, loyalist and reformist, spoke from fear, one of losing power, the other of losing purpose. The question remained whether courage could outlast convenience, and if it can, what happens when integrity becomes the most disruptive foreign policy of all? The shift arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A week after Ibrahim Traoré's address, satellite channels in East Africa began airing his full speech, unedited, untranslated, uncensored. The broadcast didn't come from state media, but from private outlets testing the limits of fear. Within 48 hours, clips flooded social networks, accumulating millions of views and sparking what one Ugandan commentator called the most uncomfortable conversation our generation has ever had. That was the turning point. The message had escaped its borders. What began as a warning had evolved into contagion, a challenge no longer contained by diplomacy. Even within Uganda's ruling party, whispers surfaced about the risk of appearing outdated. Some called it propaganda, others called it prophecy. Whatever the label, the effect was irreversible. Ibrahim Traoré had proven that narrative could move faster than armies. And from that moment forward, the battle for legitimacy was no longer fought in palaces, but in perception. One line defined it: control is an illusion. Consequences followed not through explosions, but through erosion. Institutions that once stood firm against criticism began to tremble under questions too simple to silence. Ibrahim Traoré's declaration had set off a cascade of self-reflection across Africa, one sector at a time. For states, the effect was strategic. Regional meetings turned tense as governments realized the new diplomacy valued authenticity over hierarchy. Foreign ministries, once accustomed to cautious communiques, now faced youth delegations quoting Traoré word for word. Policy memos began using phrases like values-based regionalism, a polite rebranding of defiance. The old guard saw contagion. The young saw calibration. For businesses, the tremor came through perception. Ugandan exports to Sahel markets shrank by an estimated 15% that quarter. Investors didn't flee, they hesitated. The difference was subtler, yet costlier. Contracts delayed, trust deferred. Corporate boards in Lagos and Abidjan quietly discussed political credit risk, a phrase once reserved for the West. Sovereignty had become an economic variable. For citizens, particularly the youth, the impact was psychological. Surveys showed a 38% rise in engagement with Pan-African civic platforms. Across campuses, the phrase Sahel moment turned into shorthand for moral courage. Students wore red armbands not in allegiance to Bobi Wine, but to the principle that power could and should be challenged from within the continent. It was a reclamation of voice, amplified through defiance. For the region, the stakes expanded. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger deepened cooperation through the Alliance des États du Sahel, pledging to craft an independent defense framework by 2027. Diplomats from the European Union called it a worrying precedent, but to Africans watching, it was proof of life, a system learning to breathe without permission. By then, the ripple had become rhythm. Each mention of Ibrahim Traoré carried both admiration and warning, a reminder that defiance can inspire, but it can also isolate. Still, for millions of young Africans, isolation looked preferable to invisibility. And as one commentator wrote in Nairobi, "When one leader speaks with courage, 10 million citizens rediscover theirs." As diplomats recalibrated their tone, analysts began sketching 3 possible arcs for the months ahead. None were certain, but each revealed what Ibrahim Traoré's intervention had already set in motion. One likely path is that the tension stabilizes. Uganda quietly loosens restrictions on Bobi Wine without public admission. Regional dialogue resumes under AU mediation. Traoré retains moral momentum while avoiding further isolation. Africa's leaders, uneasy yet observant, adopt his rhetoric in moderation, borrowing the language of sovereignty without imitating its audacity. History moves, but slowly. If things break in a more hopeful direction, the Sahel Alliance turns words into architecture. Joint economic forums evolve into continental councils led by mid-tier states instead of traditional powers. A shared youth charter, drafted by activists from 6 countries, becomes a symbolic Accra Declaration. Its preamble cites Ibrahim Traoré's line, "Freedom without responsibility is noise. Responsibility without freedom is slavery." In this version, conviction translates into policy. If things go the other way, the backlash hardens. Established regimes close ranks, tightening media control and labeling dissent as foreign influence. Traoré's government faces targeted financial pressure, its reforms stalled by external fatigue. The Sahel dream turns insular, celebrated in speeches, but isolated in practice. Most observers expect reality to drift between these 3 poles. Yet the true test may not be political at all, it may be psychological. After decades of dependency, Africa's confidence is rising faster than its institutions can adapt. Whether that confidence stabilizes or shatters will define the decade. In every outcome, the question echoes beneath the data. Was Ibrahim Traoré the beginning of a new equilibrium or the spark that forces the old one to burn out first? Long before governments reacted, ordinary Africans had already made up their minds. In market stalls, in classrooms, in the chatter of minibus radios, Ibrahim Traoré's words became shorthand for dignity. To those who had never seen power speak their language, it was as if someone had translated pride back into their dialect. In Burkina Faso, farmers compared his tone to the rains, late, uncertain, but cleansing. In Uganda, despite censorship, young artists painted murals of Bobi Wine beside the captain's face, 2 portraits joined by an invisible bridge of resistance. And in Senegal and Ghana, community leaders quoted his ultimatum as a civic reminder. That silence, too, is a choice. What resonated was not the threat of consequences, but the audacity of honesty. It felt less like politics, more like permission to question, to care, to belong in the conversation. Across WhatsApp groups and street cafes, people ask the same thing. If one man can say this aloud, why can't we? That was the emotional current beneath the geopolitics. Ibrahim Traoré's message had moved from the halls of power into the pulse of daily life. And once belief becomes conversational, control begins to slip. Maybe that is how change starts in Africa. Not with revolutions, but with reminders whispered loud enough to sound like courage. From defiance to design, the question became, how could Ibrahim Traoré's challenge evolve into a sustainable continental strategy rather than a solitary outburst? Analysts traced 5 steps that could turn conviction into coordination. First, institutionalize the sentiment. Transform the Sahel Alliance into a standing council with rotating leadership, ensuring that sovereignty is governed, not just declared. Second, build an African media corridor. Create regional content networks capable of broadcasting without Western intermediaries. Information, after all, is the new logistics. Third, anchor youth inclusion. Formalize youth councils across ECOWAS and AU summits, granting observer status to citizen coalitions. A procedural yet profound shift. Fourth, leverage economic interdependence. Expand intra-African trade mechanisms, already increasing by 28% since 2023. Trade, if aligned with transparency, becomes protection against manipulation. Fifth, measure sovereignty by service. Develop an annual index of independent capacity assessing how well nations provide security, health, and education without external dependency. These steps, pragmatic yet symbolic, outline a route from outrage to order. Each reduces the isolation risk that Ibrahim Traoré's rhetoric invited while preserving its spirit. They recognize that freedom without coordination risks decay, and coordination without integrity breeds new hierarchies. The blueprint is not a revolution, it is rehearsal, a way for Africa to practice autonomy before performing it on the world stage. Because in this century, sovereignty will not be defended by borders, but by systems that outlive the men who built them. When the microphones dimmed and the applause faded, Ibrahim Traoré returned to the same modest office in Ouagadougou where his rise had begun. The air was still heavy with the weight of his own words. Outside, rain traced thin rivers along the cracked pavement, a reminder that renewal rarely looks heroic. Somewhere between conviction and consequence, he seemed aware of the paradox he had unleashed. He had spoken for freedom, yet bound himself to its proof. The continent was now watching to see if he could embody the very integrity he demanded of others. In the end, leadership is not the echo, but the endurance of a promise. The young captain who once defied foreign generals was now confronting a quieter opponent, time. And perhaps that was always the real test, not whether Africa would listen, but whether he could keep believing long enough for it to answer. Conviction is easy, consistency is history. Across the continent, the echoes of Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum still linger, not as threat, but as threshold. Africa stands again at the edge of definition, where every act of silence or speech shapes the map more than lines ever did. The choice is no longer between East and West, but between memory and motion, who dares to build before being told it's possible. To the youth who listened, to the elders who doubted, to the leaders who calculated, this story is unfinished because it belongs to you. The next chapter won't be written in summits or treaties, but in the habits of courage repeated quietly, daily. Will we wait for permission, or practice sovereignty in how we think, trade, and tell the truth? Africa is watching, the world is too, and history, patient as always, is still taking notes.